All right, this is my second take on part two of the end of the Vietnam conflict. My first take got taken down by YouTube because I had copyrighted music on there that I played the air guitar to and drums. I think they just didn't like my air guitar skills. But anyway, the lyrics of the song I was trying to show you from a Woodstock performance by Country Joe McDonald are on the screen. This song gets written in 1967, comes out on an album in 1968. But if you just look at the lyrics a little bit in the chorus, and you can look up the song on your own. But 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? Don't ask me, I don't give a damn. Next stop is Vietnam. And it's 5, 6, 7, open up the pearly gates. Well, there ain't no time to wonder why. Whoopee, we're all going to die, right? And so by 1967, 1968, as we talked about in the last video, the sentiment in the U.S. is turning rapidly and overwhelmingly more anti-war, right? Anti-Vietnam. And so that song's just a really good kind of example of it. It's got a kind of a catchy beat. If you want to look it up, you can check it out. I'm sure you'll find the performance either at Woodstock or the recorded version. Now, real quick, I just wanted to talk about two things really, or two slides. Number one, I'm going to read a little section of this book called Enduring Vietnam, An American Generation at Its War. Great book. It's by James Wright. Highly recommended if you like historical reading. Now, there's a quote in here from the early 70s as I get toward the ends of this book that deals kind of with what Country Joe McDonald was talking about, right? This anti-war sentiment. It becomes apparent as we get into the early 70s, even late 60s, that the U.S. is not going to stay in Vietnam forever, right? It's losing in popularity. Nixon runs in 1968 on a platform of getting troops out of Vietnam, and he wins. So in 1968, 69, 70, people know they're not going to be there, or the U.S. isn't going to be there forever, right? So what are we really fighting for anymore? And so the troops that are there in the late 60s, early 1970s, I mean, it's a short quote out of this book, but one of the soldiers in the early 1970s says, nobody wants to be the last guy to die in Vietnam, right? Like what a useless casualty when we all know we're going to leave anyway. And so you can see we start settling peace agreements and peace settlements in 1972. Not necessarily peace settlements, but kind of agreements with the North Vietnamese about how things are going to look. We'll pull out most of our last military regiments by 73. And then ultimately, see the picture here, that happens in 1975 when we pull out our last advisors and those kind of things that are in South Vietnam. And so I wanted to read a little tiny part, and I'm going to skip around just a little bit. October 22, 1972, the U.S. and North Vietnam agreed on the terms of a peace agreement. The American troops dropped their demand for a mutual withdrawal of troops, and the Hanoi government withdrew their insistence upon a regime change. The U.S. agreed to withdraw all forces, and the North Vietnamese agreed to release all prisoners. Hey, then we get Nixon, right, in Watergate scandal. He ends up resigning, and Gerald R. Ford takes over. So in March of 1975, South Vietnam troops fell quickly with little resistance once the U.S. forces are gone. The president of South Vietnam resigned. Critical of the Americans for pressing his government to sign the peace accords and then abandoning them, the South Vietnamese government officials left the country. On April 30, the last American troops left hurriedly, with South Vietnamese who had worked with the Americans hanging on the skids to try to get on the last helicopter as it left Saigon. Most failed. The North Vietnamese army occupied the city, soon to be renamed Ho Chi Minh City, in honor of the North Vietnamese leader. Right, and so that picture, 1975, Americans and some South Vietnamese officials trying to leave. Ultimately, right, most of you guys, I think a lot of you went on the East Coast trip, right? You probably saw the Vietnam Memorial. What's the long-term impact? Well, 58,000 lives are ended, right, from an American perspective. The number for Vietnamese killed, much higher, right? I mean, these are numbers, so these are estimates, but 1.5 million is estimated. Cambodia, the next door neighbor to Vietnam, will become communist. And the U.S. government, through the legislative branch and Congress, starts to try to limit presidential powers during times of war. And so that's kind of where we are as we get into the mid 1970s, right? With everything being done in 1975.